attendees already, if everyone is ready. Yes, then first of all, a very special welcome to all of our attendees who have been following the South Asia Democratic Forum's activities and who are joining us today via Zoom and via our Facebook live stream to what will be one of the most topical discussions that will be taking place in our webinar series, Bridging Academia and Policy Making. In this, academic knowledge, evidence, and expertise can help inform, design, and ultimately make policy better, but it can only do this if policymakers and academics interact effectively. However, what we seem to hear more and more in these times of increasing tension and rapidly changing demographics is that academics and policymakers continue to be ever so distant or even more so. This begs the questions: do policymakers pay the due attention to the debates that take place in academia? Do academics fail to put themselves in the shoes of those who have to construct diplomatic relations? Are academia and policymaking completely unsynchronized? And ultimately, where do we go from here? We are going to try, within the realms of possible, to address these questions and look at some of the practicalities linked to this topic. I am going to introduce you to our panelists. We have managed an exclusively unique panel today. Thank you all for making the time to join us. I begin with Ms. Caroline Vinot. Caroline Vinot is the head of the South Asia Division at the European Union's External Action Service. The European External Action Service is the European Union's diplomatic service, and it helps the EU's Foreign Affairs Chief carry out the Union's common foreign and security policy. So we are very privileged to have someone who has experienced firsthand the intricacies of the system to give us, to share with us her insights today. We have as well Dr. Christophe Jaffrelot. Christophe is a well-known figure by everyone interested in South Asian studies, known for his critical stance and for being one of the most prolific, insightful, and deeply informed analysts of Indian politics and society, and who has remained vocal on his opinion of what the path for policy makers within the European Union should be. We have as well Dr. Faisal Devji. Faisal is Professor of Indian History and Director of the Asian Studies Center at the University of Oxford. Faisal has been described by fellow South Asianists as one of the few global intellectuals and the most brilliant scholar of his generation writing today on South Asia. And Faisal remains active in his interactions with the media for newspapers such as The Guardian, The New York Times, and The Hindu. At last, we have South Asia Democratic Forum's Executive Director, Mr. Paulo Casaca, author and editor of a number of books on the subject of contemporary South Asian studies, and effectively the manager of a bridge between academia and policy making. So without further delay, Caroline, can we start with you? What are your views on the questions that we pose today?
Thank you, Hannah, and good morning all. I hope you can hear me well. I must say that I'm experiencing some sounds issues because I hear only part of what you were saying in your introduction. But I'll try my best to follow. Maybe I will open my intervention by saying how happy, how privileged, honored I am to participate in this seminar or webinar. And I must say that I've been very impressed in the past 2 months. You know, after the first 2 or 3 weeks of sidération, which we went through in our various respective areas, when the epidemic started to spread out throughout the world, how dynamic has the academic world remained in spite of the social distancing and confinements, I have seen a tremendous amount of webinars, seminars on Zoom, and I must say that I have been very encouraged by the high level of participation, which at least I witnessed from our various services in the EU institutions, but not only, also from the national ministries of foreign affairs and administrations in general. And I think this itself, per se, is already the beginning of an answer to the many questions which, Hannah, you have put for our discussion today. The very fact that, in spite of the fact that we can't physically meet and discuss, we have overcome this with all the modern technical tools for communication in order to precisely through the difficult period which we are going through, and which raise many questions to all of us. We have all put a lot of efforts and time in getting together, continue to reflect together, to discuss, with sometimes some operational conclusions, sometimes not, but to continue this, I would say, mutual fertilization of the minds and spirits and reflections, bringing the various points of views together in order to help each other to go through this crisis together, and start reflecting on the exit strategies, and how to cope, how to respond, and how to continue to work together throughout the crisis and after. So I'm very glad to take part this morning to address some of the points which you've put. I would say this interaction between the think tanks, the academics, and the policy makers is of great importance. It's a very vivid experience for me in my current function, covering the part of the South Asia region, because that's a region where the academic world is extremely dynamic. There are really researchers, many researchers of an extremely high quality level, and we have some of their representatives this morning with us. From our perspective in the European institutions, in particular in the EAS, I see three very important tasks or opportunities which are provided by this constant dialogue we have. The first, I would say, is to offer space for dialogue. It's very important with our partners in India, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Nepal. The space for dialogue is in parallel, in complement, sometimes a reinforcement or an inspiration to the official dialogue. And I say it's very important because we have had some periods where we've experienced some difficulties to schedule, our meetings, high-level official meetings, and it's really useful to have this possibility to continue to talk to each other, to talk about each other, and to continue this, let's say, unofficial dialogue via and with the academic world and the think tanks. The second role, second importance, I would say, is a platform to get to know each other better. And it's particularly true for relations between India and the European Union, where we have a strategic partnership, we have, let's say, an institutional framework to our relationship, which organizes the amount and the rhythm, the sequencing of meetings we should have. But we felt at some point that there is a need, there is an interest in having some parallel tracks which can involve some officials and which offer this possibility to better understand each other with or without the participation of officials. And then, of course, the third important role is the channel of communication to inform the policy making. And here we have a constant dialogue with academics, with think tankers. It can be informal dialogues, it can be more, let's say, regular, institutionalized seminars, 1.5 track seminars, for example, where we tend to, where we as policymakers seek a better understanding of the region, of the challenges of our interlocutors, of the challenges which our interlocutors are facing. And this is very, very useful to help the mutual understanding, mutual trust also to progress, and it facilitates greatly our work then at official level. That's the three really important parts which we're working with. If I should detail a little bit more and provide some examples with regards to the first element which I was mentioning, the space for dialogue, we have developed over the past years with the help of the EU delegation in Delhi, for example. I say, for example, because we should not forget that there is also very active academic and think tank environment in neighboring countries, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh and Nepal as well. But to focus a little bit on India, we have had very interesting experiences of 1.5 track seminars, which really helped this. It helped our official dialogue. It helped to bring it on track. It helped to enlarge a little bit the scope of our discussions without preempting or without, let's say, committing on some, immediate operational outcome, which we knew were not necessarily possible at that point of time, but which helps preparing the future. So I'm thinking, for example, of a workshop on maritime security, which we have organized twice last year in Delhi and then in Brussels, and which were very useful to understand each other better, to foresee where we could cooperate better on maritime security, and maybe just to start with to identify more clearly together, including at official level or between officials, that indeed we had a lot in common. There was a lot at stake for both the EU and India, and there were many fields of cooperation where we could strengthen and deepen this cooperation. So our aim now is really to consolidate this track, 1.5 track, and ensure continuity to continue to bring inspiration to our work at official level. Of course, there was also a seminar which has played an important role in the finalization of the EU-India strategy, which was adopted by the EU in 2018, which was this 1.5 track seminar, which we organized in the EEAS in Brussels with the participation, and I think that was the first time that we had the Secretary West participating, with several high civil servant officials from various ministries in Delhi who came to Brussels to meet officials from the Commission in this very specific format, from which we could draw a lot of idea, a lot of feedback, which we then reflected in the strategy. When it comes to a better informing, or this platform to know each other better, I have, of course, to pay a special tribute here to the work of the EU delegation in Delhi, who has set up this think tank twinning initiative. And I don't know if Frédérique Champa is connected today at our webinar, but she has put a lot of her energy and efforts into making it happen. I think this is really a good example of track 2. I mean, a track specifically dedicated to academics, think tanks, meeting each other, getting to know each other better, and then bringing some issues, and then gradually associating policymakers with now, it's an established rendezvous at the Resina Dialogue, on the eve of the Resina Dialogue, that we have this possibility to have really a in-depth one-day discussion on the EU-India relations and how to bring it forward. And then, of course, how to inform each other better, this channel of communication to understand each other better, and for us as policymakers to understand better our interlocutors and the challenges they are facing. Here, of course, they are extremely, it's a challenge for us to be fully informed, to be able to follow, day by day, the work of the academics, because there's a lot, so we can't read everything, we can't be aware of everything, but we are trying our best to keep up. And also we have within the institutions, in particular in the EAS, a division which is in charge of policy planning, which role is precisely to analyze, observe, read, get to know what comes from the academics in order to feed our own reflection within the institutions. But we also have on a daily basis a dialogue with many of you and many colleagues throughout Europe and throughout Asia, which help us to also get a better understanding of some issues which we do discuss in our official dialogue. But it's interesting for us to hear from the academics their own point of view on issues which can be sensitive, such as domestic politics, regional cooperation, regional securities, issues like connectivity, climate change impacts in the region, issues like the Rohingya crisis. Those issues which we do discuss in the context of our official dialogue, but it's really useful for us in the institutions, in the ministries, to hear also the analysis which we get from our colleagues in the think tanks, in the academics. So this is to say that I don't think that we are desynchronized. I think we are consistently, and with a lot of dedication and interest on both sides, I should say, seeking, the right formats, the best places, the best times to meet, to discuss, to compare the notes, to compare the analysis, to share the analysis, and to get from it the inspiration which we need, the understanding which we need, while also being aware of the limits of the action, in particular of in the field of the public policies. So that's what I would say in terms of my introduction, and I will be happy to answer any additional comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I think afterwards we'll follow to Christophe, who recently tweeted that he would address the issue of why policy makers and academics are not necessarily on the same wavelength. So, Christophe, can we have your intake?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Well, I will preface my remarks by thanking Caroline for this introduction, and also by saying that I do get a view of what is happening in policy making, because I do interact with civil servants, including diplomats, on a regular basis, in France and in UK mostly, but also in Brussels sometimes, in Washington sometimes, in Delhi, where I interacted with the EU delegation till recently, and sometimes in Islamabad as well. So I do take part in track 2 dialogues, in the 1.5 dialogues Caroline was referring to. And I agree with her approach that there is a complementarity, and that's why we don't say necessarily that there is only one dialogue, but different tracks of dialogue. But complementarity precisely suggests that there are differences. We are complementary because we are not the same. We are not doing the same job. And the question, therefore, for me is when you suggest or when you say bridging the gap, well, what has to be bridged? What has to be bridged is for me the real question. And there I would make three remarks. I think that we do not do the same job because, well, the research agenda of academics is independent. Academic freedom. They formulate their research question, they make their hypothesis, they collect empirical material to test the hypothesis, and they come out with some conclusion. And they ask small or big questions, but most of them, at least for the political scientists, arc back to democracy, rule of law, human rights. These are what we do on the field and from the field independently. Policymakers may be aware of these findings, but they do not enjoy the same kind of independence. And they may, at least privately, agree with what academics say. They can't be as independent as academics are because they have to factor in many other variables which overdetermine their attitude, especially when negotiations are going on, when you have strategic negotiations, trade negotiations, deals in the pipeline, any kinds of deal. They may be, again, trade-related, military-related, arms deals being at the intersection of trade and military cooperation. Well, if what academics say are putting at risk, are jeopardizing the fate of these negotiations, the policymakers will not be in a position to simply echo what the academics say, because that would make some of the official agenda derail. So there is, by nature, indeed a complementarity that can go very far, because it can go to a contradiction at the end of the day. And especially in the context of what we call economic diplomacy. Economic diplomacy is a phrase that emerged in France after many others. The previous one was completely different. Right2P, R2P was on the contrary a way to somewhat interfere with other countries, you can say sovereignty, in order to make human rights prevail. Economic diplomacy, on the contrary, implies that you may promote trade, economic relations at the expense of other considerations. So that's the first big difference that for me is why we are complementary, but not necessarily on the same wavelength. Secondly, there is a timing question. The timing of policymakers is not the timing of academics. Academics can work on the same topic for years, dig into detailed research agendas. Policymakers have to deliver, not necessarily very quickly, but be they politicians or be they diplomats, they have 3, 4, 5 years maximum to show results. When you have to show results, you cannot necessarily go for principles mostly. You have to be pragmatic, and therefore that's another difference that I like to highlight. A third difference is, I think, based on the kind of sources of information. Many academics do fieldwork, interview people at the grassroots level. They have a kind of sociological knowledge of the issues. It's much more difficult for policymakers to be exposed to the same kind of information. And in fact, that's why they have to rely on scholars, for having this kind of first-hand information. But of course, there is inevitably a kind of dilution, a kind of mediation. To be exposed to first-hand knowledge makes a big difference. And I see that when I meet diplomats who go to the field, who go to district towns or even small towns or even villages, and others who have not made this effort. It makes a big difference. But of course, most of them don't have the time, and it's not their job. Again, I repeat, it's a different job. So inevitably, the kind of information you get is also different. So these are the three reasons why I do think that bridging is necessary, but not so easy. That said, I would draw two lessons from my own experience that is now something like 4 decades old. As an academic, I still find it important to write briefs for policymakers and to interact with policymakers and to be part of the tracks, whatever they are, for the reasons Caroline has mentioned. You know, you say things official can't say, and that helps more or less. It can help minimally, and you make hardly any progress, but it can help. At least I think it's my duty as a civil servant myself to share with those who are in the decision-making process, to know what I think I know, and to know what I think I know better, because I've worked on it for many years with a lot of investment. So I do it. Secondly, even if they cannot do much, some of the policymakers try their best. And they can try their best officially, and they can try their best more or less unofficially as well, because they are human beings like anybody. And therefore, to share with them in their official capacity what we know as scholars is very important. And sometimes it makes some impact. Sometimes you see the result of this. So that's why the difference is there. I think it's radical. But to bridge it, even for some minimal impact, is worth doing. Last but not least, I would like to qualify, finally, the difference between academics and policymakers in non-so-democratic context. In not-so-democratic context, in semi-democratic context, or in illiberal democratic context, you may see a convergence. You can see a convergence because the policymakers and the academics may feel some new influences coming from fear, coming from intimidation, coming from money, who pays for the study as well. So when you lose the academic freedom for any of these reasons, fear of being refused as a visa applicant, fear of being trolled by intimidating extremists, to say a neutral word, then you also self-censor academia. Academics are, in that sense, also not so independent because they are under some other influences. And here you see a convergence, and then you can see what I would call official academics. You would see academics who would not differ, who would not dissent. And that's probably where an organization like yours, South Asia Democratic Forum, has a role to play, to be the crucible for a democratic atmosphere that makes it possible for independence from fear, independence from money, independence from vested interests, from lobbies, to hijack the dialogue, because the dialogue indeed is very much needed. And I hope we'll have other occasions to substantiate this hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christophe. I will now pass the word to Faisal.
Thank you very much. I entirely agree with what has been said so far by Caroline and by Christophe. And compared to them, I have very little experience in policy making or any impact on it at all. But as a historian, let me begin with what I think is happening with the structures that mediate between academics on the one hand and policymakers on the other. And these structures, and they've been mentioned, think tanks, semi-governmental institutions that serve as interfaces between the public, the informed public, and especially the academic side of it, and policymakers. Many, if not most of these institutions are products of the Cold War. Certainly they come out of the Second World War. And of course, in the Second World War, academic institutions themselves were reshaped by the war. And we cannot think of disciplines such as anthropology, or to some degree even history, to say nothing of political science, without understanding that they were entirely reshaped or very largely reshaped during the Second World War and into the Cold War. And the United States represents perhaps the most developed model of this interface, with its plethora of think tanks, each one of which has a certain kind of ideological position. And that is as it should be, because you are meant to have more than one of these positions, each one of which lobbies the government or policymakers more generally. And they are meant to sort of gather together or be gathered by governmental institutions such as the Department of State. I would like to suggest, and of course lobbyists, whom Christophe also mentioned, are part of this interface. Both lobbyists from ideological groups within countries like the United States, but also increasingly lobbyists in the pay of foreign countries. And this has, as you know, become an important talking point, shall we say, in the US today. Now, I would like to suggest that this entire and very complex structure of interface, which makes possible institutionally the links between academics and policymakers, is under some threat today, at least in the Anglo-American world. And yet, at the same time, it is sought to be reproduced in places like India, with all the caveats that Christophe mentioned about intimidation and fear and money. So in Delhi today, you also have a number of think tanks. You also have government or semi-government institutions. And you have, Brookings, and you have Carnegie, and you have the usual suspects there. But what has always struck me, and these are new entrants, what has always struck me about this situation is that, unlike in the US, for instance, apart from the governmental bodies, none of the others seems to have any specific ideological position. They share the same set of people who wander through them, including myself. And so you're not getting anything very different. They're not playing the role that these institutions are meant to play. They're playing the role that the IIC, the India International Center, used to play and still does, where everyone can go through and say the same thing. And the Indian press works in the same way. The second thing I would like to suggest is that amazingly, for a country the size of India with its power and its influence, New Delhi has never managed to constitute itself as the authoritative site for knowledge production, even about its own neighbors, let alone itself. If you really want to know strategically about either India or, say, Pakistan, to say nothing of Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, etc., you're unlikely to go to New Delhi. It cannot even produce information, or at least a narrative, a global narrative about its own biggest enemy, Pakistan, or China for that matter. That is a significant failing. I'm not quite sure where it comes from, but I think it's very, very interesting. This inability, despite the fact that India is full of academics, it is the most well-endowed country in South Asia in terms of intellectual quality. But for whatever reason, it's been unable to, if you will, capture that market. You still have to go to New York or Washington or London or perhaps Brussels for that kind of narrative. So on the one hand, then I suggest the old Cold War world of that made possible an institutional interface between academia and policymaking is coming apart. On the other hand, in India, it never seems to have taken off. Now, let me say something about what I mean by this interface coming apart in the Anglo-American world. I think we all know that the Foreign Office in London or the State Department in Washington are no longer really in the position of making policy, foreign policy. It's very interesting that policymaking is moved straight into the executive directly. So it's in the Prime Minister's office or it's in the White House. It's not clear whether the State Department, which in fact has not even been filled with the required number of officials it's meant to possess in this administration, has less and less say in foreign policy, although it might be required to implement policies that are made in the executive itself. This, I think, is quite interesting, and I don't know if it suggests that both Britain and the United States are becoming more like other countries. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I'll leave you or the audience to judge. The other thing I think that's happening, and then might provide a reason for this, is that there has been a kind of neoliberalization of these institutions. And you see this, I think, happening in a very big way, though its roots go back earlier. It starts happening in a very big way with the war on terror. So post 9/11, where you have outside contractors, so the semi-privatization of the military itself, US and to some degree British, along with these private contractors who, of course, they're not for policymaking necessarily, but for the provision of intelligence to some degree, translations, implementation, and all the rest. They're not meant to make policy, but of course they inevitably have an influence on the making of policy insofar as they provide the data very often, or they create facts on the ground. So apart from outside contractors, academics and other, as it were, specialists in places, or those who think they're specialists in particular places, ended up becoming a bit like outside contractors themselves in this, if you will, this neoliberal model. And they're attached to policymaking or to governments through money, because the way in which this works is that, let me give you an example. So just about 10 years ago, just before I came to the UK from the US, there was a project that was launched by the Pentagon in cooperation with the National Science Foundation called Project Minerva. And as you know, Hegel, the owl of Minerva, only flies at night. And this was meant to be a project that brought on board academics to advise government, and in particular, the Department of Defense. And there was a huge controversy because how could academics lend themselves to the war on terror, etc. And I had written a piece for the Social Sciences Research Council saying, that's all very well, but let's not forget that none of these academic disciplines is pure. They were all shaped, as I said earlier, by the Second World War. So when you refuse to advise government, you have to ask yourself this question: is this an issue of principle? Would you have refused to advise the government, if it were fighting against the Nazis? Will you refuse to advise the government on any war, or is this a matter of choice? And depending on what your answer is, you will have to provide a justification. So immediately the next day, of course, I received an invitation to be part of the evaluating body in Washington for Project Minerva, to look at these proposals that had come in from academics. And since I was leaving for Oxford anyway, I thought, well, let me have some experience of what this world is like. I went to Washington. I was put in some kind of secretive place with military people. And then we were all meant to sign all kinds of secret statements. And we were sat in a room and we got all these proposals on computers. We were never handed them out before because we were not allowed, of course, to see them or to have an ability to print them out. And much to my interest, I found out that I would say 70 to 75% of these proposals were from second or third tier American universities, from people I'd never heard of, who were clearly in it for the money because they had been transformed into these, as it were, agents of a neoliberal form of governmentality, in which money had been promised, and what they wanted the money for was to increase their stature in the department, get tenure, get a lot of money for a big project that the university would like them for. They were not actually interested in the policy. They often proposed completely unrealistic projects, and of course, they were all rejected. But I found it fascinating that you were not getting the best quality minds applying themselves to this, that you were getting unrealistic projects by people who were not really interested, who were in it for other reasons. And I offered this example only to suggest that this might be one of the flaws, one of the drawbacks of this way of operating. Where you put out a call, there's a lot of money attached to it, people apply for whatever reasons they apply for. And if they are given the money to do what they want to do, what ends up being produced is a lot of reports that then become part of a tick box exercise at the State Department, where they can say, look, we've done this. And indeed, and I'll close with this comment, I had the opportunity to speak to a former undersecretary in charge of South Asia at the Department of State some years ago. And he said to me, speaking about Afghanistan, which let us count in South Asia for the moment, he said, look, I mean, what the Department of Defense does is it commissions all these consultants, and it commissions outside contractors, and it commissions academics to write various kinds of policy statements, consulted statements, etc. And they all pile up. And when the next general is sent in to Kabul, he actually, turns up in a room, the floor where from the ceiling to the floor is filled with these documents. And all he can do is get rid of them. There's no way he can even read them. They're not meant to be read. They're part of a tick box exercise because this is what is required, and everyone can say we have done what we need to do. So I think this is quite instructive. A lot of knowledge might well be embodied in those documents that have necessarily to be thrown away. But the way in which the neoliberalization of policy, as far as I can tell, works, discourages the reception and reflection upon such knowledge. So I just wonder whether there might be a different way to approach the problem.
Thank you very much, Faisal. Now, lastly, before we go on to addressing some of the points raised, pass the word on to Paulo Casaca, our Executive Director.
Thank you very much, Anna. Let me first congratulate you for the great work you have done for the organization of this webinar, getting together such high-profile people to address the issue that is at the core of the interest of SADF is really a landmark. We are very grateful, all of us in the SADF, for having had this income from you. You are very young in our organization. You are very young, but you are also very young in our organization, and you really made an impressive mark on it already. I would like to say that we also are thrilled with having these three personalities with us. Ambassador Vinot, who has an incredible curriculum. I mean, she has been the permanent representative to her country to the European Union. Although I'm not acquainted with French diplomacy in particular, well, in Portugal it is the highest normal diplomatic position that one can aspire to. I was once a counselor in a Portuguese permanent representation, and I know how things are, and so I think you are really someone with an incredible background that brought a lot of insight to the European institutions. Professor Jaffrelot, you have been for a long time in our board of advisors. You are a leading academic in South Asia. I would like to say that your challenge regarding the capacity to have a playground for discussion that is not disturbed by interests groups, by money, by any other of these sort of interferences, and really thinks about the general good is really our ultimate aim. It's really what we aspire to. It's something I would very, very much like to continue to contribute. Professor Devji, you spoke about the homogenization of think tanks. You spoke about a lot of I think it is mostly a bureaucratic malaise of international organizations when you see piling up studies and reports, and nobody even can take them on board. Of course, there is a tremendous problem there. I would say that coming back to Europe, one of the things that impressed me the most when I was European parliamentarian was the assessment of a parliamentarian from Cape Verde, a very good friend of mine, José Pina, and he once told me, well, the European Union is like a Portuguese sideboard. I think that you can call it that way in English. Actually, you can even use the Portuguese word contador. Although, in Portugal, normally they are known fundamentally as either Chinese or Indian, or sometimes Portuguese-Indian contadores. Well, this sideboard that we are also acquainted in pharmacies, all pharmacies, all these small boxes. And the issue is that there are loads of small boxes, but how to communicate from one box to the other, that's the big problem. And this calls to the attention of the importance of interdisciplinary studies and intersectoral studies as well. And of course, to be done in an international level. This is something that I think we managed to give our humble contribution in the context of a European sponsored program, Global India. I think it is one of the best programs where we have ever been involved. It is a program that is financed by H2020 that gets together 6 major Indian universities side by side with 6 major European universities, and also with 6 organizations like think tanks like ourselves. We are one of the 6 that have a supplementary role, and that has been able in the years that it has been going through to tackle most of the most important issues that we are being challenged on the political way, and this has been done through the academics of all these 12 institutions, and with a very good interlink with the European policy making bodies. This has been very good. We are now engaged in a new program that is in the context of Erasmus Plus, the Eurasian Insights Strengthening Indo-Pacific studies in Europe. This is not necessarily South Asian. This involves as well Indian universities, some European, but it involves as well universities from Australia, from Japan. So it has a different focus, but it still goes on a tradition, on a European tradition, which is the Erasmus tradition. That I think it's perhaps the most important tool of European policy. The Erasmus is a program that is really building Europe, did a lot to build Europe. I think nothing did so much for Europe as Erasmus. It certainly did more than the common agricultural policy or many other sectoral policies, that fisheries policies that we are all very aware of, because this allows the youth to experience different realities, to have different views, to intermingle with different countries. And this is exactly what is tried to be done in the Erasmus Plus context. I think it is a very, very good program, and I do hope that this pandemic crisis will not jeopardize it, and that policymakers, and this is really a message I would like to be heard in EAS, that policymakers will understand the need. Of course, this is very good to have Zoom and to speak once with the others, although Zoom has some problems, as Ambassador Vinot already told us. Well, she is not allowed to, and apparently, if we were to say something that would not be very politically correct regarding China, possibly we would not be able to continue this conversation either, as we saw the censorship very recently on the celebration of the Tiananmen massacre. Well, but this is not the main issue. The main issue is that we are social animals. We are really social animals. We really need to interact. We really need to know each other. We really need to be in contact. And for this, we have not only to continue, but to strengthen the existing programs. As far as I believe, or at least some years ago when I looked at the figures, India was the most important country in terms of Erasmus Plus for Europe. So it is very meaningful for South Asia and for India in particular. And I hope it will really be increased, and we will manage to overcome the problems. Ourselves as ADF, we have always a lot of problems when we want to bring academics from South Asia to any conference in Brussels. It's really a problem, and of course we know that this is not always a European policymaker problem. The states continue to be very important, but still I would like to call my best attention to this issue. Well, and secondly, I would like to say that I think that we may contribute to discussions that are not simply the repeating of the chorus, which is what Professor Devji was saying was the case in New Delhi, but I really think it is a bit everywhere, with some exceptions. But you go to Washington, you go from think tank to think tank, and you hear the same music. And well, Washington, I have a lot of experience there. Well, not as many as you, because you live there. I never lived. But I don't think it's only New Delhi, and of course Brussels as well. Well, I don't think that London might be so different. So, although there are some differences, but this is important to have the capacity to engage in issues like, just to mention two of them, the climate change or the Rohingya refugee crisis, in a different way, not only repeating gospels, but getting different points of view. We actually tried our best to get together, traveling from Burma, Myanmar to Bangladesh, and the politicians and the refugee camps and so on. We did make some inroads on this direction. Actually, they were not enough, and they were not supported. So we could not go to the end of what we wanted to do. But for instance, there I really sensed that this is the issue for a think tank like us to have a positive contribution, because even in the European structures, I mean, this Portuguese sideboard is always there. You have the drawer of the responsible people that are in Dhaka and the ones that are in Burma. Well, and this does not always go ones with the others. The United Nations even was. That's something I do recall. So this is exactly the sort of thing where I think we could really be useful. Not to mention climate change. We have been very engaged in climate change for a long time. I think that we are assisting to a reversal of the facts, where, in particular in areas like South Asia, where the water management is really the big issue, and the mismanagement of water has a tremendous impact on emissions. And it's not that the climate change is impact is increased by the whole of the water management issue that comprises, of course, mostly the issue of agriculture is the fundamental one, but urbanization as well. So it's not something that we can say it's secondary. No, it's the main one. And there we started. That's a good example. We started to see being accepted things that are completely ludicrous, like the problems coming from the whole of the Himalayas are because of the climate change, when the reverse is true. I mean, the mismanagement of the water coming from the Himalayan systems are one of the big reasons why of negative climate impacts. And the same goes for the sea. I mean, the water of the sea invades the land, not because the sea level is increasing, but because we are pumping too much water, too much drinking water. And so communication between different sorts of water layers makes the seawater coming in ashore. These are examples where we have seen the need to say something different. I mean, to look at the reality fundamentally, and not to repeat the gospel that is approved somewhere. I really would like to see that we could increase this sort of presence, of catalytic presence on debates regarding South Asia. These two, as the issue of development, as the issue of poverty, as many other issues. I think we can have a role. I think the academics are obviously the most important part of this reflection. The policymakers are essential because they know what they are dealing with. I think we can have a role, and I am really very enthusiastic after seeing these prominent people like yourselves accepting to be with us on this debate. Thank you very much for your presence.
Thank you very much, Paulo, for your intervention. I think now, since we're privileged enough to have Caroline with us, I'll give her some space to comment on the intervention so far.
Thank you. I risk being cut in the middle of my comment because I'm running out of battery. I would just want to say that first, modesty obliges me to clarify that I have not yet been the permanent representative to the EU, but I hope one day it will come. No, just to say that I fully agree with all the elements which were represented by Christophe, and I think it's good that academics are critics, and it's good that we, on our side as policymakers, are well aware of those critics, because that helps us again getting a better understanding of complex situations. Our job, as Christophe says, is not the same job. Our job is to handle complex situations, but it can't be done properly if it's ignored or the complexities are ignored. Very much agree also on the issue of the timing. And this I would connect it with what Faisal was saying, and thank you very much for alerting us, Faisal, on this impact of the liberalization of the academics. I think it's a real issue. It is also an issue which exists for us in the EU institutions, due to our own processes of how we function, how we finance projects and consortia and so on. So this is something we really need to pay attention, and it's good that you raise it. Our timing is indeed shorter, and our turnover in terms of the civil servants in charge is much shorter than yours. As I was reading Christophe's thesis and then first books already long time ago, and he's still a specialist, the famous specialist, while I have in the meantime been doing other things than following up on the South Asian issues. So I have lost a lot of the competence and the expertise which you have continued to build. So this is why our dialogue is very important. And Christophe, you mentioned the diplomats who go to the grassroots, to the country, who visit the countryside. And I would say it's the same at all levels on our side. There are good diplomats, some who maybe take less time to really do their job and go to get to know the in-depth country where they are posted. Probably the same for academics. Some are probably eager to go deeper into the substance than some of those which, Faisal, you might have been confronted to. My message to you is come and meet us. If not me, my successor, when there will be a successor, my management. It's really important, and institutions like yours, Paulo, and Hannah is very important for that. It's really important to come and continue to, I don't dare saying harassing, but make your points. Come visit us, come making your points, come passing your messages to all the generations of civil servants which will continue to serve with more or less motivation and more or less competence. That's life, that's human. But in general, we try to have a good diplomats, and especially with a good knowledge of the region on which they exert their responsibilities. But indeed, it's really important that you as academics continue to irrigate our knowledge of the situation in the countries and regions which we're working with, and that you continue to do it as generations of civil servants are rotating, if I may say so. That's my call for you. And sorry if I'm interrupted before the end of our meeting. Over.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for all your insights. I know, and I think the interesting thing about this panel is that Caroline is very aware and reading Christophe's work for a long time, and Christophe and Faisal have been friends and fellow academians for a number of years. I was wondering, Christophe, do you have something that you would like to comment? I mean, Faisal was particularly critic on the production of knowledge in New Delhi. Would you like to follow up on that?
I can say a word on that, because I agree. There are very few specialists of the neighboring countries, including China. China being, of course, overrepresented among them. But I would say that it's true to in almost every direction. There are very few Indian specialists of non-Indian issues. And that's something indeed very disturbing sometimes. And when they invest in some expertise, they end up in a foreign country in many cases. So in DC, you have many Indian specialists of IR, of non-Indian countries, but they are not in India anymore. So that's a real challenge, because we do not interact so easily with experts of international affairs. If I may add 3 points quickly. One has to do with one of the questions that was asked by Rina Agarwal on the chat, because she made 2 interesting points that I want to highlight. Some academics become policymakers, so you can say fluidity is not so exceptional for some domains, including her discipline is economics. I would say on that front that when an academic becomes a policymaker, he is a policymaker and not an academic anymore. I mean, it's very difficult to be on both sides. You inevitably lose what I call the independence when you enter the system. And many of them have resigned, by the way, because they were very attached to this independence and they did not want to lose it. The second point she makes is very interesting also regarding the role academics have on the public sphere as op-ed writers. We keep writing op-eds, and I think it's a very important, an increasingly important role that we play, precisely because it's not so easy to influence the policymakers. So if you want to influence the policymakers today, you have to make a detour by using public opinion. And this is the ultimate tool we do have. And they can't ignore public opinion as much as they can ignore us. And that takes me to my third and last point. There is no doubt that it's more difficult to make our points heard by policymakers when we speak about human rights, when we speak about minorities' rights, when we speak about rule of law. It's more and more difficult. And that's why we use op-eds as well. But how can we explain this? And I would speak as a European, but we could speak as in a larger perspective. But as a European, I think this is a reflection of the decline of the EU, the decline in terms of balance of power. To dare to speak in the name of our values, the European values, the democratic values, is more difficult than it used to be. And I don't think if Tiananmen occurred now, we would impose the kind of sanctions the EU imposed in 1989. Just to give an example. To say no is not so easy, and it's a reflection of some decline in terms of balance of power. We do still believe in our values, but we don't dare to project them as much as we used to. And secondly, it's related precisely to the rise of China. Because a country like India will appear as a balancing power vis-à-vis China. And therefore, you may not speak in the name of the European values to India because you think that you need another partner vis-à-vis China. That is the #1 threat ultimately. So these two things go together. I think there is absolutely no doubt about that. Plus, third, last but not least, the rise of non-democratic leaders across the board. So it's much more difficult to speak in the name of democracy when you have Viktor Orban not respecting democracy within the EU. How can you speak about democracy out of the EU if it is not respected within the EU? So we are at a time when the shrinking of the democratic space makes diplomacy of human rights more complicated, and therefore the job of the academics who try to influence the policymakers more difficult as well. And that's a way also to respond to the question, why do you write so many op-eds? Well, that's the detour. That's the detour we have to use these days.
Faisal, would you like to make any further comments on the?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just think I want to agree and just elaborate on a couple of things Christophe just said. One, which has to do with the role of the diaspora Indian. And as we know, India has probably the largest diaspora in the world. It's something like 16 or 17 million people. It's very, very large. And now, of course, it's a diaspora that has, especially in the US and in the UK, produced a large intellectual class as well as a quite wealthy population in general. And you know, I think Christophe is quite right in foregrounding their role, which can be productive, but which can also be incredibly misleading, you know, because very often what you see in the US particularly is sort of diasporic intellectuals of Indian origin sort of pushing a line for India to toe that might not actually be in India's interests. You know, for them, India's interests must be aligned with American interests. There can be no other possibility. But this is not to take India's specific policy objectives and interests seriously. It's a kind of fudge which they can manage to do precisely because they position themselves both in India and in America. You know, and a number of things that have been going on recently. Basically the pro-American side of things, right? So it doesn't necessarily do India any favors. On the other hand, the large population of diasporic Indians in Britain or in the US also makes them important for American policymakers because they are, to use an Indian term, a vote bank, right? So when the Indian Prime Minister goes to Houston, the American president has to be there. When the Indian Prime Minister came to Britain, the British Prime Minister had to be there. You know, even though the Indians were there to see the Indian Prime Minister, they were not there to see their own Prime Minister or their own president. So it mixes up all kinds of things. There's a kind of vote bank politics and a demographic issue there for the host countries themselves, which was not the case in the past. And secondly, there's kind of wishful thinking of diasporic policymakers, especially vis-a-vis India. Another thing Christophe was saying had to do, of course, in his first set of comments with the importance of difference, that academics must have a different language than policymakers. And this is useful for policymakers. You know, there has to be obviously a mediation and a translation precisely because of what I was saying earlier. If the academic is only there to pitch their ideas, like in a version of that television show, The Apprentice, which the American president in his previous incarnation used to run, then there is no difference. And this is what I see happening over and over again, where academics in the situation I described in Washington are basically trying to get money by telling policymakers what they think the policymakers want to hear. The policymakers must want to hear X, Y, and Z, and so we will actually produce this for them. But that's not the way it should work. If I read what Christophe has said correctly, there has to be a difference. And this is something that is incredibly productive for policymakers themselves. Otherwise, you're just getting the same thing that they already think. And they're just getting more, as it were, statistics and data, and etc. And finally, the third thing which is linked to that has to do with the fact that the problem in a way is the marketization of opinions. What I was just saying, you know, you're an academic and you want to pitch your idea like you're pitching it, you know, for a product, you're trademarking it, you're branding it, you want to sell it in the market. And that doesn't necessarily produce the best ideas. One way of dealing with that is to do what, and here I take Caroline's point seriously, is to have academics actually more deeply involved with policymakers, not just there to give an occasional talk, but actually there institutionally, so that you might have one academic or two looking at policy documents. Obviously, I'm talking about non-classified materials here, or able to look back upon them, so that there's a learning process that happens. Whereas for the moment, what I think happens for the most part, not with everyone, is that the academic is brought in either to give a talk or to present, to write up some kind of policy statement, and that's it. There's no other, nothing else happens. Whereas I think what's important is precisely the follow-up. That's more important, perhaps, than the initial presentation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Faisal. I think we've come very close to what next question. Thank you all for deconstructing as well the title of this debate and for your practical approaches to it. Paulo, would you like to?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Anna, and let me take this opportunity to thank the very large audience that has been following us, and the large number of comments and questions that have been raised. My apologies to Ambassador Vinot. She is not there any longer, but actually this is in the biography that we published, and actually it is written in several other places. I found it myself a bit strange, because that's really something, the top of the tops. So she probably was in a position. I'm sorry for this. But let me go on this very interesting issue that both Christophe and Faisal discussed, this issue of the large diaspora, the Indian diaspora, even bigger if we consider South Asia. One of the things that strikes me and gets a lot in a way to understand what Faisal said is that when you go to the Indian, small shop, and you go to the Chinese shop, what is the difference? I mean, the Chinese shop, you will find only Chinese products, and the whole of the system is fully Chinese. You go to the Indian shop, perhaps you see half of the things over there are made in China. And the rest is made a bit wherever it is easier or it is cheaper. And so he has no problem. The Indian shop has no problem selling whatever. And I think you are absolutely right in characterizing the Indian diaspora, mostly in the United States. I think it is an amazing diaspora. But of course, it does not translate directly into an Indian surplus. And I do think that India, of course, looks a lot to the diaspora. Actually, India has been very enthusiastic with Portugal, because our prime minister ancestors, I mean, grandfather and grandfather, they come from Goa in India. Now we have actually several other ministers that are originated from Goa. So Goa and so India gets, very flattered by this. And well, in Goa, people are, when I was there, everybody was speaking about this. Oh yeah, your prime minister is one of ours. So people are very happy with it. But I think that they are sufficiently wise to understand that this does not at all translate into something that India can use like it is used in China, as a matter of fact. So the difference is enormous. Well, and actually this issue of the European values, when Alexander the Great got to the Indus Valley, his forces were absolutely mesmerized by the democratic, aristocratic sort of societies that they found over there. Some almost, well, over nearly 2,000 years ago. I mean, 1,700 years ago at least. So, I mean, European, we have to be a bit careful. And of course, I mean, the democracy really came from America nowadays. Actually, Fukuyama, I think he's absolutely right, saying that the first European country in our modern, contemporarily, that introduced democratic, nearly full democracy was Greece, as in the past. But I mean, the United Kingdom took a very long time to get into the most important things that we consider to be the essence of democracy. To give an example, so I think that in our dialogue with South Asia, we should not. I don't think we should accept this idea of the Western values and our values. I mean, these are common values mostly. That's the way I see it, and we should follow them, taking this into consideration. And more than that, I think obviously that there are lots of differences, and of course levels of development and so on and so on. But fundamentally, we should go for a concept of two peninsulas out of the Euro-Asian landmass that have a lot to learn one from the other, the Indian and the European one. That's a bit the way I look into it. So we are coming into
sorry, yeah, we're almost there in time. We have 9 minutes left, but this is a very unique opportunity. I've been informed by Dr. Christophe Jaffrelot that he would like to say something else. And
just a few words, because this is, I think, key, and I would indeed like to seize this opportunity to say that if we could indeed have a debate on what are our common values, because it's a black box till you open it. And if we want to do the job, as academics, we would like to do this job. Look at political culture, political anthropology, political history, of course, and Faisal knows history better than me, and see where do we stand, and are these common values, A, not so difficult to define, B, implemented the same way on both sides, and C, does it mean that we are not only partners for trade, for deals, but on the same page as somewhat a civilization? Because that, at the end of the day, is what you suggest. That would be a terrific colloquium. I would be very much happy to take part in this one.
Very good.
Thank you very much. We've lost Caroline along the way, but through another means of technology, WhatsApp, she's told me that she wasn't able to reconnect and we couldn't solve that issue. But thank you very much to all 4 of our panelists for your presence, for making time in your busy schedules, and for creating this unique opportunity, also for seeing again old friends, I think. And SADF looks forward to seeing you on our next webinar on the 23rd of June on Indian climate change. And with that, I say again, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope to see you soon. We hope to see you soon.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye, bye, bye.